At the beginning of the 20th century, the most powerful currency in the world was not the US dollar. It was the British pound. For more than a century, the pound sterling had dominated global trade and finance. Around 80% of the world's monetary reserves were held in pounds, and London was the center of the international financial system. Countries trusted the British currency because the United Kingdom was one of the largest creditors in the world and controlled the most influential financial markets of the time. If a country needed loans, investments, or financial services, chances were those transactions would pass through London and be conducted in pounds. But today, the situation looks very different. The US dollar has become the most powerful currency on Earth. It is used in roughly 40% of global trade, more than half of international debt is issued in dollars, and critical commodities like oil are priced almost entirely in the American currency. Governments around the world hold massive dollar reserves in their central banks. Global financial markets move in response to decisions made in Washington and New York. And yet this raises a fascinating question. How did the dollar manage to replace the pound and become the world's dominant currency? To understand that transformation, we need to go back to a time when the global financial system worked very differently. Before the First World War, many countries followed a system known as the gold standard. Under this system, currencies were tied directly to gold. If someone held a pound, a franc, or a dollar, they could theoretically exchange that money for a fixed amount of gold held by the country's central bank. This system created stability because governments could not simply print unlimited amounts of money. Every unit of currency needed to be supported by gold reserves. As long as the gold standard functioned, exchange rates between major currencies remained relatively stable, and international trade was predictable. But this stability would not last. When World War I erupted in 1914, governments suddenly needed enormous amounts of money to finance their militaries. The gold standard quickly became a problem. Countries needed to print large quantities of currency to fund the war effort, and maintaining full gold convertibility became impossible. One by one, major European powers suspended the gold standard. This decision triggered inflation, financial instability, and a collapse in confidence in many European currencies. And the situation became even worse a few decades later. World War II devastated much of Europe. Cities were destroyed, industries were crippled, and national economies were exhausted by years of conflict. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States emerged from the war in a remarkably strong position. American factories had expanded massively during the war. Its economy had become the largest in the world, and perhaps most importantly, the United States had accumulated an enormous share of the world's gold reserves. By the end of the war, the United States controlled nearly 70% of the world's gold supply. This gave the country extraordinary financial power. But even more important than gold was the role the United States began to play in rebuilding the global economy. American banks became major lenders to European nations trying to recover from the devastation of war. Programs such as the Marshall Plan provided billions of dollars in aid and investment to rebuild Western Europe. As dollars flowed across the world through trade, loans, and reconstruction efforts, the American currency gradually became more important in international finance. Still, the system needed stability. After years of financial chaos and competitive currency devaluations during the interwar period, global leaders wanted to create a more stable international monetary system. And that moment arrived in 1944. That year, representatives from 44 countries gathered in a small town in New Hampshire for a historic conference that would reshape the global financial order. The meeting became known as the Bretton Woods Conference. The goal of the conference was to prevent the kind of economic instability that had contributed to global conflict and depression in the previous decades. Leaders wanted to create a system that would stabilize exchange rates and encourage international trade. The solution they designed placed the US dollar at the center of the global monetary system. Under the Bretton Woods system, many currencies around the world were fixed to the US dollar, while the dollar itself was tied to gold. This arrangement effectively made the dollar the anchor of the international financial system. Countries trusted the dollar because it could theoretically be converted into gold. At the same time, the enormous size and strength of the American economy reinforced confidence in the currency. And for a time, the system worked extremely well. Global trade expanded rapidly during the decades after World War II. Financial markets stabilized, and the US dollar became the dominant reserve currency held by central banks around the world. By the 1970s, roughly 85% of global reserves were held in dollars. But behind the scenes, a problem was beginning to emerge. As the global economy expanded, more and more dollars circulated around the world. The United States began running large government deficits and increasing spending on domestic programs and international commitments. Over time, this meant that far more dollars existed than the amount of gold held by the US government to back them. Eventually, maintaining the gold link became impossible. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would permanently change the global financial system. The United States ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The Bretton Woods system effectively collapsed overnight. From that moment forward, the value of the dollar would be determined by supply and demand in global markets rather than by gold. In theory, this decision could have undermined global confidence in the dollar. But surprisingly, the opposite happened. The dollar remained dominant. The reason was simple but powerful. By that point, the dollar was already deeply embedded in the global economy. International trade, financial markets, government reserves, and global debt were all heavily tied to the American currency. Changing the system would have been extremely difficult, and so the dollar remained at the center of global finance. This position also gave the United States something economists sometimes call an exorbitant privilege. Because so much of the world relies on the dollar, the United States can borrow money more easily than other countries and finance deficits in its own currency. In addition, control over the global financial system allows the US government to impose powerful economic sanctions on other nations. But this system also creates challenges. During global crises, investors often rush toward the dollar because it is considered a safe asset. This sudden demand can strengthen the currency dramatically, making American exports more expensive and sometimes hurting US industries. Even so, the dollar remains the dominant currency in the world today. Other countries have tried to challenge that dominance. China, for example, has been promoting the international use of its currency, the yuan, in global trade and financial agreements. Over time, this strategy may increase the yuan's influence in international markets. But replacing the dollar would not be easy. The dominance of a global currency depends not only on economic size, but also on financial transparency, political stability, and global trust. Historically, the world's leading currencies have belonged to nations with stable institutions and open financial systems. And for now, the United States still holds that position. The dollar's rise from a national currency to the backbone of the global financial system was not the result of a single decision. It was shaped by wars, economic crises, political agreements, and decades of growing financial influence. And even today, the legacy of those events continues to shape the world economy. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this and leave a like.